Welcome to episode 50 of Successful Demo. In this episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of manually released cards. We are back after a long hiatus, thanks to the Kitara cycle being delayed. But we finally have our hands on Sovereign side, and we are going to start off our new series with Naja 1.0. This Bioroid Barrier HB Ice is basically a shitty version of Eli 1.0. Let's watch it in action. Yeah, okay, fine. We are still gonna play Naja 1.0 in the deck, but there's not much point spending too much time talking about it since it's pretty similar to Eli 1.0, it's just a lot worse. The only good reason to play Naja 1.0 is because Eli 1.0 is gone, right? So, instead, we'll talk about a more interesting card. That is Ikawah project. Yes. Besides being annoying to pronounce, this agenda is also pretty annoying for the runner to steal. Or at least that's what we thought when it was first spoiled. But then I do a side-by-side comparison with it with a pre-rotation agenda. Some of you might remember this wonderful agenda called NAPD Contract. NAPD costs 4 credits for the runner to steal, meaning that it costs more for the runner to steal than Ikawah project. It gives less agenda points to the runner than Ikawah project, and is not restricted in faction, unlike Ikawah, which is restricted to HB. So for a 5-3 defensive agenda, Ikawah is pretty mediocre. Not too surprising given that it's starting out the series of defensive 5-3 agendas. The first one is probably the crappiest, and that's what we get. It is relatively low power level in my opinion, and the situations or decks that it's worth playing in are rather limited. Basically, it's agenda fodder in the sense that, you know, there's not a huge variety of agendas. We need to pad our agenda suite, but we don't really want to score these agendas. Let's just put a couple of Ikawas in there. That is basically about as much use out of Ikawah as you're gonna get. I can imagine Ikawah project being useful in a food court style deck where all you're concerned with is scoring blank agendas at the end of the game after you have set up your impenetrable ice and defensive upgrades. But firstly, food court style decks are no longer viable without Caprice, and secondly, even if they were, well, Ikawah is pretty mediocre at best as it provides minimal defense by itself. So if you really want to unleash the true potential of Ikawah project, you have to build it around some other cards to make use of the fact that the runner needs to have a spare click to steal it. Otherwise, it's just pretty mediocre. So when you think about synergistic cards, the first one that pops into mind immediately is Fairchild 3.0. It's pretty obvious for a 4-click runner, a regular 4-click runner. If you spend your entire turn clicking through Fairchild 3, you will have no clicks remaining during the access phase to steal the Ikawah project. So that's a pretty huge deal, and it's the reason why if you're playing Ikawah project, this is almost certainly your restricted card of choice, Fairchild 3. There's very little reason to pick any other restricted card. The other card that pops into mind immediately is the card that synergizes with click loss. Yes, we are talking about everyone's favorite defensive upgrade that is so tied with the word jank because it almost never fires, but when it does, it's such a game-changing impact. It's Heinlein Grid. No one has ever managed to make it work. Well, that's because Ikawah wasn't printed back then. Well, now we have something that directly synergizes with it. For a low cost of a 2-card combo, you can potentially get a very well-defended agenda, because now your agenda reads, as an additional cost to steal Ikawah project, the runner must lose all their credits and spend a click. So yeah, well, you're bankrupt now. And that can be very devastating, especially if the runner has been basically hitting Magno Opus a bunch, or, you know, just hoarding credits with Tapworm, expecting that when you install advanced and agenda, they'll just snipe it and not take much of a tempo hit. The question is, how do you further make use of this? How do you leverage on the runner being bankrupt in such a deck? Because surely you want to do something to make use of the fact that the runner's going to be super poor for a turn. Well, conveniently enough, there are some Wayland cards that can help us out with that. Brian Stinson, a very obvious choice. When the runner's low on credits, you get a huge gain in tempo. And Punitive Counter-Strike, of course, which is, I mean, we saw this with the Obo Carter combo. Punitive Obo Carter is one of the cutest things you can do, and I'm sure a lot of people have tried it out. Well, you can do the same with Heinlein Grid into Ikawah into Punitive Counter-Strike. Very cute and very combo-tastic. I do not personally recommend going down this route, but, well, YOLO, this is a successful demonstration, so we've got to try this out, right? Alright, yeah, for those of you who don't have time to play much Netrunner, I'm gonna fulfill your wishes right now. We are gonna see some punitive Counter-Strike action. The problem with using punitive in a Ikawah deck is obviously your kryptonite in Film Critic. Film Critic disables these two win conditions completely, utterly, which is very, very ugly. So we can't build a deck that is just going to completely fold to this one runner card that Corps don't want you to know about. So what can we do about it? Well, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of spending influence on a very, very narrow hate card, but what needs to be done has to be done. We have got to play some form of Film Critic Destroyer. There are quite a few candidates out there, but I think the most reliable one will be the MC Informant. So we are going to play a couple copies of those, and this is our final deck. Now, I really wanted to play 2 Brian Stinson in this deck because Stinson works so well with Heinlein Grid, but I just couldn't find the influence for it. After stuffing my deck with MC Informants and Punitives, I did not have influence for the second Brian Stinson. I was 1 influence pip short. If only CI was a 17 influence ID. One can only wish. So with the remaining 2 influence, I dumped it on the Newshound instead, so that hopefully should do some work with the 3 scarcity of resources I'm running. Not just to counter employee strike, but also to slow down the economy of resource-based runners. That can be very helpful in delaying the early game to a point where I can fire off Brian Stinson in the early game. That could be pretty cool. So, once again, let's dive into the game. So for those of you who've never played CI before, here's a little secret. If your opening hand has no clearances, mull the heck out of it. So our mulligan hand has no clearances at all! I'm so pissed off. But anyway, the texture of hand is still rather acceptable given it's a non-clearance hand. It has ice and no agendas, meaning that we can get away with not icing HQ, which means I can reserve the Naja 1.0 in my hand for some other server. Not to mention that I also have a scarcity in my hand, which is really useful for thwarting my opponent if they are on resource-based Anarch, which they seem to be, because their max mill showed me a daily cast and retrieval run, so they are running resources, so that scarcity is gonna stay, which is nice. They can't remove it by running HQ because there are no agendas in there. However, my opponent has other plans up their sleeves. After running HQ, you've guessed it, it's Anarch. They're gonna play that nasty event, mining accident. So I'm forced to either pay 5 or take 1 bad pub. If I pay 5, I am going to go down to 0 credits. I'll lose all my money. That is unacceptable. I unfortunately have to take the bad pub, which is pretty bad for this deck because I actually am relying somewhat on my taxing ice to keep my opponent taxed out. Remember, we are a punitive deck. If our opponent is not paying to get through our servers, we can't strike them with meat damage. It's also worth mentioning that I have the IPO in my hand, so I badly want to play it. However, my opening turn prevented me from doing so because I spent the 1 credit to play scarcity. What that meant was that I'm not in turn 2 IPO range, which was a pity. My opponent then runs my hand again and trashed my only Brian Stinson, which makes me a bit sad. Well, at least it's a huge credit hit for my opponent. So, my priority here is to get the IPO going ASAP. So, I'm just going to click for a bunch of credits and then ice HQ preemptively. You'll never know when you draw an agenda next, especially if you top deck a violet level clearance, and the last thing you want is to draw into a bunch of agendas that your opponent can easily steal from an undefended HQ. Now, the scarcity of resources, which is still in play, is causing a lot of trouble for my opponent. Even though we can't see their hand, you can assume that they're trying to play around the extra resource costs, which is causing them a lot of problems. They are being forced to play in a way that's not ideal to them, and as a result, they are slowed down, makes it easier for me to land punitives later on. But they've solved it by finding their hacktivists, and that allows them to drop their liberated for the regular costs. But, well, that's still a win for me. It made them pay 1 credit and a card from the hand, and a click, and it doesn't really do much to affect me. That hacktivist isn't really going to cause me any problems because this deck isn't really reliant on assets. There are a couple of upgrades in this deck, but I can afford to lose 1 or 2 cards from my very large hand as CI. You can see my hand right now, it has a whopping 4 cards in there. Isn't that amazing? That's exactly what you want as CI. Bloody hell. Where are my clearances? I run 6 of them. I've drawn through at least 1/5 of my deck and I haven't found a single one. This is ridiculous. I mouth for it even. This is pretty ridiculous. As you can see, I'm kind of struggling because I'm not getting the cards and the credits I need to score quickly. That Iwaka project, Ikawah project sitting in my hand is annoying the shit out of me, and it's not just because I can't pronounce its name properly. I continue drawing up, but all I find are the cards I'm not needing now. I'm finding ice, which is nice. Don't get me wrong, in games where you don't find your ice, you can be in serious trouble. I'm drawing a lot of ice considering that this deck doesn't run that many ice. I think it's 13 or 14 pieces. What I really want to see are the clearances which draw me into my combo pieces. I want to see the Heinlein grid. I want to see some good agendas to score. Early on, I'd rather score the Vitruviuses than the Ikawah project, because yeah, it's pretty expensive to score the Ikawah right now, and I don't want to score it and put myself down at a credit level which I can't sustain. Don't forget, I need to res ice, I need to spend money advancing agendas. I cannot dip too low in credits, otherwise CI's ability will go against me. Another mining accident hits the table. This time I can afford the 5 credits to play it, to counter it, because I have an IPO in hand that can negate the credit punishment. Again, we don't want to give up bad pup. Unfortunately, my opponent has Retrieval run a Fem onto R&D and now has free access to R&D. It's an Architect that's sitting on R&D, so I chose not to res it there, being 4 cost to res and only 2 to break for my opponent. Alright, top deck is a Scarcity. This is pretty good against my opponent, so I'm going to play it here and then IPO up. My opponent can easily get rid of the Scarcity, but they'll have to pay the same old thing to do that. And same old things are pretty precious for Max, who typically wants to reserve it for key events like Leviar Lab Access, which is almost certainly my opponent's restricted card. So they play yet another same old thing under the influence of Scarcity. That costs them a bit of money, and I draw into MC Informant. It's not going to be useful this matchup. They don't pack Film Critic, nor do they have any connections that are relevant. Alright, so I continue drawing up. Still no clearances. Man, this is getting on my nerves. I mean, the clearances aren't a direct win condition, but, you know, without them, how am I supposed to keep afloat? My punitive win condition is slowly but surely sliding away from me. As you can see, my opponent is building up the economy engine very well, even under the influence of Scarcity. Now, they're going to run HQ, figuring there are lots of agendas in hand, and they usually would be right. I've drawn about more than a third of my deck, actually, so you would expect there are 6 to 7 agenda points in my hand on average. I haven't drawn many agendas, but I've also not drawn any clearances either. So it's a double-edged sword, I guess. I would rather have the clearances, to be honest. In any case, my opponent sieges through my Architect and Naja, bringing out the paperclip to break the Naja, and they access a punitive. So they already know that I'm a punitive deck, so it is quite risky that they are ending that. They're going down to so few credits to run, but they hit the Liberator and go back to a good amount of money. Now I start drawing those six agenda points I talked about earlier, so it's time to stuff them in a remote. And here's where I make my first very crucial mistake. I should have left the Vitruvius in hand instead of attempting to score it here, because if I were my opponent here, I would run straight through that remote, and I can't do anything to stop my opponent. My remote is double fetch out 3, which in theory stops my opponent. But in practice it doesn't, because to res both ice I need to pay all 12 of my credits. And as CI I cannot afford to do that, especially not with 2 big agendas in hand. So if my opponent decided to run that remote, I was going to lose the agenda. So that was a big mistake from me, but somehow, thankfully, it worked out because my opponent made the subpar play of running HQ instead. When running the remote would have guaranteed them an agenda, they ran HQ instead and got a bigger agenda. They hit my Ikawah project. Well, I guess my opponent wasn't making the wrong play after all. They ran HQ, they broke the ice, and they stole the Ikawah, paying a click and 2 credits, putting them relatively poor, but they get the Hacktivist back up again, and they drop the Citadel Sanctuary, preventing me from making a kill. Even though they're on 0 credits, I can't kill them through Citadel Sanctuary. I can fire 2 punitives. One will clear their hand of cards, the other will get soaked up by Citadel Sanctuary. Am I willing to spend 6 credits on 2 punitives for this? I don't think so, especially not when my opponent has Levy in the bin. They can simply recur their deck and they'll be healthy and safe again. So instead, I decided to go for the alternative play that punishes my opponent when they're poor. the Brian Stinson play. I play Archive Memories on Stinson in the bin that my opponent trashed, and then installed Stinson and used it on IPO, putting me at 23 credits. The cost? The other Ikawah project from my hand. It was milled by the hacktivist and I was pissed off because that hacktivist could snipe any other card in my hand. I would have been fine with it. I'm okay with losing the punitives here because I knew that was not going to be a win condition anymore. Usually you need 2 punitives to kill the runner. With Citadel out, you probably need 3 and a lot of money, a huge credit advantage. Basically the runner has to be dirt poor. So I knew that punitive was off the tables from this point onwards, the moment they dropped the meat damage hit. So I was just going to attempt to win via Heinlein Grid and Ikawah, but that's not going to happen either because one Ikawah is in the score area of my opponent and one's in the bin. Hopefully my opponent doesn't run it. I need some time to get it back. I definitely have ways of recurring the Ikawah from my bin, but I need some time to put them into action. So it's really scary knowing that my opponent can easily get to 6 points just by running the Ikawah in my bin, or worse still, mad dashing the bin would auto win them the game. So scary. But they continue hammering my hand for some reason, and funny enough, all the agendas are now evacuated from it thanks to the bad luck on hacktivists and the poor play, so-called poor play on my part of jamming the Vitruvius in the remote. HQ is actually the server I'm least worried about. It's not expensive for my opponent to get through, but it still attacks. They're paying 5 credits every time with 1 bad pup. Because it turns out Fem is pretty bad at breaking Strength 3 Architects. I draw into my Heinlein Grid here, so this is where I can start playing the Glacier game. So I'm looking at my opponent's bin and figuring out what's the next line of play for me here. And I decided that I was not going to win this game if my opponent stole Ikawah from Archives without any contest whatsoever. So I single advance the Vitruvius. If my opponent doesn't steal the Ikawah from my bin, I can overscore the Vitruvius next turn and pull the Ikawah back to my hand in a pinch. That would be a good way not only to deny my opponent that agenda, which is rightfully theirs, but more importantly to also get a 3-pointer to score behind the Heinlein Grid. Now my opponent runs Archives here, but thankfully not to access Archives, which is their best server, but rather as an Omar run. They just played Rebirth into Omar and are now going to access R&D for 2 cards with Turning Wheel. Alright, they completely whiff on that one. So again, very lucky for me considering that I've drawn through basically half my deck, but I haven't seen half my agendas just yet. Yep, it's pretty tenuous this situation right now because if they actually stole an agenda from R&D, well, they'll be on match point and that's terrible because they can just lock my remote for the victory. So that's another scary thing about this deck. If your opponent ever gets to match point, it's going to be very difficult to win off Punitive or Heinlein Grid because neither of those actually directly protect your agendas. Your opponent steals them and wins the game before you can kill them. So, as I mentioned, the Vitruvius is scored and now we are back in business. I don't have to worry about the agenda in the bin. I just need to worry about my opponent sieging my R&D. It's still pretty porous. It's a Naja 1.0 on the outside and an Architect on the inside. My biggest worry here is that the outermost Naja on R&D is perfect fodder for my opponent to bounce off. So they can keep running the Naja and ending the run, which will allow them to farm Turning Wheel counters for free. This is a very big threat that I need to mitigate. So I'm looking for ice here, and to get ice I need to get money, and to get money I need to use Vitruvius to recur Brian Stinson here. So even though I knew there was an agenda in the bin, it seems like my opponent doesn't know about it, so I'm just going to use the my Vitruvius counter on something more productive. In this case, the Brian Stinson trigger that gets me to 30 credits. So from now on, I basically don't have to worry about money for rezzing ice, money for padding my hand size, because Brian Stinson basically gave me 2 IPOs worth of triggers. The other reason I did this was because I knew the Ikawah in Archives was going nowhere. I had the Fairchild 3 in my hand, which I played on the same turn on Archives. This is a very, very awesome dual purpose. Firstly, my opponent thinks that I'm trying to deter them from Omar runs, but in actual fact, I'm deterring them from making proper Archives runs. So they will almost certainly not access the agenda in Archives, which means that's one less agenda to worry about. And to make things even worse for my opponent, I'm going to place an upgrade on Archives. It's the Heinlein Grid, which will punish them if they choose to click through Archives. The Fairchild Archives, bankrupting them. Of course, this might draw attention to Archives and make them run Archives proper instead, but Well, with Heinlein Grid protecting the Ikawah and archives, it's not that bad. I could get a surprise victory with that if my opponent's not careful. So yeah, archives is very well defended. That Ikawah and archives feels very safe right now, protected by the Fairchild 3 and Heinlein Grid. Combined with my opponent being Omar, they are most likely not going to run archives for the sake of running archives. Finally, after digging through more than half my deck, I found my first clearance in 6. It's the Ultraviolet, and I finally get what I want, which is the good feeling of being CI and having so many awesome cards in hand. Whew, I mean, I'm playing a rather fair deck, to be honest, so it was really, really painful not having those clearances. I think it just goes to show how busted CI is in conjunction with Violet and Ultraviolet in the same card pool. So hopefully, Most Wanted List 4.1 sooner or later. I don't know. You know, ban CI or something. I don't know. Ban the clearances. Whatever it is a very powerful combination. Anyway, my opponent keeps hitting my hand here, and surprisingly, I'm still not drawing my agendas even after that clearance play. No agendas. You bet I would have jammed an agenda in my remote if I actually drew into it. You'll notice that my remote is perfectly safe right now, protected by 2 Fairchild 3s and a Heinlein Grid. There's no problem. My opponent would have been too poor to contest that remote, so any agenda I drew would have gone in there. But I didn't draw an agenda until now. Here's the Vitruvius. It's time to put it in the remote. The question is, do I advance it? I say yes, because it's well protected. I have the money to defend it. The bigger worry for me is not so much the remote. I can easily punish a remote run by resing Heinlein Grid here. The problem is R&D. I overrode the Architect, which was femmed, and put in a Fairchild 2 instead. So this does 2 things. Firstly, it gets rid of the useless Architect that was fem, but more importantly, now that the outermost ice is spiky, it prevents them from farming turning wheel counters on R&D. So that is most of the R&D threat mitigated. We still have to keep in mind that they're running indexing, so they could still easily win off R&D. And speak of the devil, here's the indexing. Thankfully, I fortify R&D, so this should be very expensive for my opponent to get to. They're going to index my Fairchild 2, and they have 1 click remaining. So this is going to be a very expensive run, and they won't be able to double dip if there's an agenda in R&D, meaning that they will probably try to put the agenda as the 2nd or 3rd card on R&D so that they can run it next turn. You notice they end the run with 3 credits. They can't get in again without sacrificing a lot of material. They would have to basically trash most of their board in order to get past the Fairchild 2, take a brain damage. All these will force them into punitive range, so that's bad. But I see the stim hack, and oh dear, this could be game. If they have 2 agendas on top of R&D, they can use a turning wheel counter and access them both to win. But nope, they did not double dip. They did not access 2 cards, they just accessed the elective upgrade. Oh, they hit my trap card. That's a 3-point agenda. They don't even have the credits to beat the base trace on punitive. With triple punitive in my hand and no I've had worse in their hand, I easily secure the victory for this game. Upon later inspection, it was revealed that there was a Vitruvius within the indexing cards that my opponent didn't steal. Had they saw the turning wheel line of play, they would have won the game before I could meat damage them to death. Wowzers, that was close. So as we saw from the final turn of the game there, this deck has a serious problem. With the win conditions embedded in your deck, you might not get to pull them off before the runner gets to 7 agenda points. I really should have lost that game if my opponent played the turning wheel correctly. And this is the problem with using Punitive and Heinlein Grid in this deck, because they do not help you when the runner is on their final turn getting their final points to win. There's no point bankrupting your opponent and landing a meat damage kill when you don't have the time to do so, when the runner wins before you get to land these stuff. So a Heinlein Grid on R&D would not have done anything there. However, what would have helped was if my opponent saw an Ikawah instead of the elective upgrade on R&D. This would have meant that they would not be able to steal the Ikawah since they made the final run on their final click. And yeah, that would have prevented them from getting any possibility of getting 7 points in the first place. So in that sense, you can say that Ikawah is good, in that it forces runners to think twice about making indexing runs on click 3 and then running click 4, because they can't steal Ikawah that way. So that's a minor upside to Ikawah, but it's something worth keeping note of, especially when you're playing as the runner against an Ikawah corporation. Alright, Heinlein Grid, I want to love this card so much, I really do, but as we saw this game, 0 triggers. I did not even have the opportunity to res it. There are so many counters to Heinlein Grid, you can list them all. Political Operative, Black Orchestra, which my opponent was running. It's an expensive icebreaker to use to break Fairchild 3, but if they ever ran Archives, they could have used Black Orchestra in a pinch, and I wouldn't get a Heinlein Grid trigger. Heinlein Grid also doesn't synergize with most of my agendas. It's only the Ikawahs that it protects. If I'm trying to score an overscored Vitruvius, as you saw me do, Heinlein Grid does nothing. It's no Ash, or Caprice. It doesn't work in every situation. And that's the reality of it. It's a very situational defensive upgrade that is too limited in scope. Even with a deck that's built around this card and Ikawah project, there are still a lot of games where it simply doesn't fire off. And good runner play avoids it. As you saw, my opponents simply laser focused on the unupgraded R&D, allowing them to skirt past the Heinlein Grid and nearly almost snatch the win from my claws. It is very underwhelming to place Heinlein Grid on R&D. I would say that my second grid going on Archives was not a mistake. If I put it on R&D, it would not have done anything to change the game. So there you have it. I'd rather play Crisium Grid, to be honest, to prevent indexings in the first place. Now, Naja 1.0,